Good morning. It's a rainy morning. You know, I always suspect that the rain scares a few Christians away. I'm not sure why. I mean, maybe they're afraid they'll melt. But I'm glad y'all braved it and you're here. So, this past week, Monica called me kind of shook up on the way to school. She got in a near accident. She was driving and someone on the right-hand lane, someone in the middle lane, this is the best I can figure it out anyhow, veered to the right to avoid something that had fallen in the middle of the road at 70 miles an hour and went right into her, probably couldn't see her. And she ended up at 70 miles an hour locking her brakes, running over to the shoulder, and she said she saw a car stopped with somebody outside. She thought, thank God it wasn't a little further. I would have killed somebody, you know? And so she was shook up and didn't think he'd hit him. It turns out he grazed the front of the car. So it didn't do really a whole lot of damage. There's a little dent there, but she was just, you know, kind of shook up by it. At 70 miles an hour, she could have died. And then my son had 2 blowouts 2 days in a row. And I'm like, do you need to change your tires? He says, I have plenty of tread on them. I think it was bad luck. He hit a curb one day. He's not sure what happened the second day. And then I read an article, and this is, I'm not kidding you, yesterday I read this article, I guess it was the day before Friday, and it said that a research poll done said that people pray more often in their car than they do in church. So, you know, probably a good thing. It's a good time to pray. Then I woke up this morning and there's another mass shooting in Allen, Texas. And we used to live real close to there in Irving, Texas. And read the article this morning that said an outlet mall in Allen. And I think that there's at least 9 dead. And Monica was telling me a lot of people are critical. What's going on with our world? You know, there's been several mass shootings this past week. I read somewhere there's been 190, and they count them as 4 people or more were killed this year. It's just like unheard of. And I'm thinking, what gets into somebody's mind that they decide to take a gun and go out and kill innocent people, and then themselves knowing that they're going to die at the end of this. And it's just a world without God. It's a world without purpose, a world without meaning, a confused world that are somehow being fed all sorts of mirages and lies and junk into their brain in this world, and they don't know how to decipher somehow and sift through it. And we live in this world. And we could be victims of a mass shooting. We could be victims of a car accident. We could be victims of disease. There's all these things, and we know this, and some of us have experienced this already or have loved ones that have experienced this. And so, you know, it's a matter of whether or not we're ready for the life that we live in. And that's the dilemma of suffering, is God so kindly gave us life, but because sin entered into the world, we live in a fallen world. And so God doesn't necessarily bring all this on us. We brought it on us from the very beginning with Adam and Eve. And we can't exactly say we're innocent because every one of us in here can admit that we've sinned as well. And when things sometimes happen to me that look like they're going in a bad direction, I can't cry out too badly at God. He already gives me more grace than I deserve. I think sometimes it's a problem when we think we deserve more. Like all of a sudden we've earned more. You haven't earned anything. Everything you have, God gave you. Now maybe you were responsible for some of the things that God gave you, but He could also take it away just as quickly as He gave it to you. So we have to be humble. And we looked last week and talked about the fact that one of the things that Jesus came to do, a big part of His ministry, He came to comfort the sufferer. He came to touch the hearts of the brokenhearted, to heal the sight of the blind. That's one of the things Jesus came to do, and it's one of the things that we're called to do, right? And we talked last week about how it's important to have the right words. Sometimes we just need to be with someone. You need to be careful about giving advice. They're going to learn something, but it's not your job to tell them they're going to learn something. It's probably not your job to teach them. They're going to learn it. The suffering will teach them. God will let them know at the right time. We also talked about how important it is to lament. And you have Lamentations. We didn't talk about that last week, written by Jeremiah. And it's a long lament about what's happening in Judah and how they've left God and God's destruction and judgment is coming on them. And then the book of Job, it's all about a cry out to God because Job can't understand why all this suffering is in his life. And he actually gets mad at God. We talked about that last week. And there's a lot of psalms of lament in the book of Psalm. And we talked about the fact that there's this spiritual principle that if you don't express your grief, you actually get to keep your grief. We were made for some reason by God to express our grief when it comes into our life. We're supposed to cry out. We're supposed to talk to God. We're supposed to express our feelings and our thoughts. And somehow God works through that and it opens the door for God to come in. And we talked about how important it is to trust God's timing. And today I want to talk to you more about trust. I want to go a little deeper into trust. And we're going to do it by starting with the story of Joseph. If you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis chapter 37. Now, Joseph is about to embark here on a string of bad luck. And so we're just going to start here where his father tells Joseph to go check on his brothers. And we're going to start here in verse 12. Of chapter 37. So his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, well, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I'll send you to them. And he said to him, well, here am I. So he said to him, go now and see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, what are you seeking? And he says, I'm seeking my brothers. And he said, well, tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock. And the man said, well, they've gone away, for I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Now, I want you to think about all the bad luck. He gets to Shechem, they're gone. Well, that's great, Dad. I came home, I couldn't find them, but some guy happened to be around there and saw him and said, what are you looking for? And he said, well, my brothers. He said, well, I just happened to overhear a conversation. That was bad luck. And they're in Dothan. So he goes to find them. And then in verse 18, it says, well, they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. Now, it's a bad luck now that they're in Dothan, because Dothan is further away than Shechem. There's not as many people there. So now he's in an isolated place. And his brothers, we know from earlier, and we're going to look at this later, hated and were jealous of Joseph. So now they have a great opportunity just to kill him, because now he's out there and they're thinking about it. Well, Reuben intervenes in verse 22 and said to them, well, shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So Reuben doesn't want him to kill him. And so he says, just throw him in that pit. And he's thinking, I'll come back later and save him. But then Reuben runs an errand. And so Reuben has to run off for a little while. And then of all the luck, here comes this band of Ishmael traders from Midian headed to Egypt. And Judah sees him. And in verse 26 says to his brothers, well, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother in our own flesh. Well, that sounds really nice. He's our brother. Let's not kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery. You know, that's the nice part of it. And then these Midianite traders take him. And then if you look at the end of the chapter in verse 36, it says, meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So he's just going to check on his brothers, and he ends up being sold as a slave. He ends up as a slave bought by Potiphar, the captain of the guard. And you know the rest of the story. His wife takes a fancy to Joseph and starts trying to get him to lie with her. He refuses. One day, he comes in, she grabs his cloak, he leaves it and runs away because he doesn't want to sin. And she accuses him of coming in and trying to force himself on her. So now Potiphar throws him in jail. So here's the story of Joseph. He was 17 when he went to check on his brothers. And by the time he gets out of prison, he's 30. For 13 years, he was a slave or in prison. And Joseph had to have been wondering, well, where was God through all this? Can you imagine he was in a pit, crying out, begging his brothers for his life, praying to God, and then they sell him to slavers? And then he's praying all the way to Egypt and worried about what's going to happen, and he ends up in Potiphar's house, and things actually started going well for him in Potiphar's house. And he started rising through the ranks, and then he gets thrown in prison. Nothing is working. But here's the first thing I want to tell you that Joseph did right through all this, and he did some things wrong, we're going to see, is he never quit trusting God. Through all of this bad string of circumstances, this bad luck that happened to him, he kept trusting God. Look in chapter 39, and verse 7 through 9. So it says, now Joseph was handsome in form and in appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me, but he refused, and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he's put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So here Joseph is. We know that he still has his faith in God. He tells Potiphar's wife, I can't do this. It would be a sin against God. And we know that God was with them. Look over in verse 20. And it says, Joseph's master took him and put him, put him in prison. There we go. Took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. And the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. Whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. So we know that with all this string of bad events that happened to Joseph, he never quit trusting God. And we know that even when he's thrown in prison and he becomes sort of the superintendent of the prison, that Pharaoh will then throw both his cupbearer and his baker into prison. And they are disturbed because they have a dream. They come to Joseph, and what does Joseph say? He says, well, that's not a problem, not because I can interpret dreams. He says, because God can interpret dreams. And so through all this, there's also God at work. And that's the crazy thing about it. All of this is bad luck, but you look back and here he went to Egypt, of all places he could have gone. And when he was there, he ends up being bought by Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard, so that now when he does something and he gets thrown in prison, he's in Pharaoh's prison. And you read that in verse 20, it's not just any prison, he's in the prison that Pharaoh uses. So that now when two of Pharaoh's officials come in there and he interprets their dreams, God has now laid the foundation so that when Pharaoh has a dream, his cupbearer is going to remember that Joseph had interpreted his dream, so now that Joseph can end up at his side and be the prime minister of all of Egypt. And so what we learn through the story of Joseph is no matter what happens, God's in control. In Romans 8, verse 28, it says this. It says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Now, sometimes that's real easy for me to believe, and other times I still struggle with it. Because what God being in control for Joseph may not mean the same thing as God being in control of Kevin's life or my mother's life or your life. Because Joseph, everything ended up great. He did 13 years. So you tell me, Kevin, spend 13 years of slavery and you can be the prime minister. I'd have to think about it, but I'd probably say, okay. Well, at least if I was 30, I don't know at this age. That might sound a little long. And Joseph could look back and see how God was working. But Job, y'all remember Job's story? Job has everything taken away from him. Think about it. He lost his whole family. He lost them all. And it's for nothing that he did wrong. And there's this heavenly discussion going on between Satan and God where God says, go ahead and sift him. And Satan says, oh, I can steal him from you. And there's this bizarre conversation going. And at the end, when Job yells at God and God comes and shows himself to him and Job sort of repents. And then Job has everything restored. But guess what? Job still doesn't know why all this happened. You and I do. We read the book. Job has no idea why all these bad things happened in his life and he lost his whole family. But Job still trusts God. And so how do you trust God when it's hard to see what he's doing? Because I believe he's in control, but sometimes I just can't see it all. And here's a story I want to read to you out of this book called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering by Timothy Keller. It's not for the faint of heart. It's a little heady, but if you get into theology and you want to read something deep, I recommend it. But this is a life story in here by Russ and Sue. So this is a real story. And Russ talks about how they had this marriage and it didn't start off great. But in 2000, he says, our world was in upheaval from unexpected news of cancer. And here's what Sue, his wife, says. The night before I was to hear the results of my biopsy, I was in anguish and despair. Suddenly, an undeniable presence entered the room. An overpowering sense of calm overwhelmed me, and I heard, it'll be all right, I'm with you. That chilling moment was a gift that not only lulled me to sleep that night, but gave me the strength to hear that I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and it would sustain me through all my ordeals, the thought that God was with her. But no sooner had we celebrated the end of chemotherapy when the cancer returned with a vengeance. This necessitated a stem cell transplant, a high-dose chemotherapy, and a 50-50 chance of survival, followed by radiation. It was clearly evident how little control we had. And Russ says this, we spent 3 weeks together through the stem cell procedure as Sue's immunity was reduced to 0. We faced the issue of mortality. We had deep talks and quiet contemplation. And I felt such closeness to God and my wife as if in a peaceful parallel universe. The most difficult thing was how to handle the what if God were to allow her to die. I needed to truly be able to say, your will, not mine. And she went on to recover and God spared me the torment. And then Sue says, well, the treatment eliminated the cancer, but a year later caused pulmonary fibrosis, an incurable progressive scarring of the lungs, and over time, the only option for survival was a double lung transplant. So she gets rid of the cancer, and now because of the treatment, she needs lungs. And she says, I prayed desperately to be spared the procedure, but the disease outpaced the cure. And the support we received through the church, friends, neighbors, and family was a testimony to God's faithful hand. After 3 failed attempts, the replacement lungs were a match. And as the doctors operated, I could see angels entering their bodies. And I woke 2 days later, euphoric. My first thought was, Lord, you did it. I was blessed with more time. My thoughts were then with my donor, who in death became my lifesaver. And the rest of this is all Russ talking. The first night at home, we felt a mutual sense of awe, tremendous joy, and deep reverence toward God. A glimpse of heaven was revealed when for a brief night we felt love and intimacy with Him deepened to a completely different level. It was an unforgettable experience of shared relief and contentment and utter bliss so intense that neither of us wanted it to end. It was quite literally a mountaintop experience that encourages us to this day. Our joy in the days that followed was immense, but in the 4th month, signs of rejection and chronic lung disease ensued, along with the talk that she needed another lung transplant. And listen carefully to these last few words here. These volatile and unresolved medical issues are a source of deep frustration and sadness and place difficult burdens on our family. Yet somehow God eases the pain, the exhaustion, and the anger when we can't bear it anymore. And he still encourages us forward. His face appears in the gracious actions of others, and our gratitude runs alongside our sorrow. We know that God is holding us up, working on our behalf, and we feel it and see it, and we're uplifted by it. But we've come to accept that we will not have the life of stability and comfort that we hoped for. We've come to realize that we should not have been striving for stability and comfort, but that total dependence on God, from whom we draw strength, is what we should have been striving for. This requires a daily effort to give up all to Him. Our real comfort is the promise that in heaven, our joy will be made greater as a result of the depth of our distress. We may be crippled still, but empowered by our renewed faith. God has helped us to persevere, and that gives us the hope and strength we need to carry on. She's not going to become prime minister. She's not going to have all her health and wealth restored, but they still are connecting with God in a deep way and still acknowledge that God's in control. And Romans 8:28, right after saying that all these things work to the good of those who are called according to God's purpose, he goes on to say, for those whom he knew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. So I want to bring this up just briefly. The idea of predestination. Does God cause all this to happen? Does God bring on my cancer? And there's this debate out there in the religious world, by the way. And there's two extremes to me. There's one extreme that says God just wound the world up and let it go. And there's another extreme that says God planned every little thing that happened to you and it's all his will. Everything's decided. Everyone who's going to be a Christian is decided. It almost doesn't give room for free will. And to me, the truth is somewhere in the middle. It says here that we were predestined, by the way, to be conformed to Christ. The predestination that we as Christians have received is not the promise of no illness, but the promise that we'll be conformed to Christ even if it's through illness. I don't know. I've heard this one, well, it's not that God does it. He just knows everything you're going to do ahead of time, and so he uses what you're going to do. That's about the best one I've heard. But I'm going to be honest with you. I don't understand it all. And anybody that tells you they understand it all, take it with a grain of salt, because someone else understands it differently than they do, and they understand it all. I'm not God. I wish I could see all this and make sense out of it. Job couldn't make sense out of it. I can't make sense out of some of these things. But I know that God is still God. And I know that God is in control and he's using all this to mold me and shape me into his image. And sometimes I think God brings messages into our life. Sometimes it's through suffering, but to me, the message is always a reminder to go back to God. I do the dumbest thing sometimes. I'm sure none of you do this. But I have back problems. And I bet 3 or 4 times since I've been here, Don's told me about all these exercises to do. And you know what? I tell Don, well, thanks for sharing those all with me, Don, but I know all those exercises because I've had back problems for a long time too, and I've had to do them. But what I didn't tell them is I'm not really doing them. I know about them, I'm just not doing them. And you know what? My back went out really bad last week, and last week I sat almost the whole time because of my back. Today I'm sitting just to sit. My back's just fine. But you know why it's fine? I did exercises all week. It's amazing. It's almost like I got a new back. Another crazy thing happened. I've struggled back and forth with acid reflux, and I had all sorts of health issues. Thank God they seem to be disappearing, and I thank him for that every day. But when I went to Brazil, my acid reflux just got worse and worse, and I got back home, and I thought, well, you know, I had told myself I was going to give up coffee, and I did for a little while till it got better, but I love coffee. Well, I gave up coffee, and my acid reflux has gone away. I tell you all that because God is always working to tell you something. He's always working to call you towards something. He's always reminding you of a way you can be closer to him and how you can put greater faith in him. But we sometimes walk away from the best lessons like we never heard them to begin with. And that's not a smart thing to do with God, because God's in control, but he's inviting us to walk with him, and he's always molding us through all this. In Hebrews chapter 12, it says this about God and his discipline. Beginning in verse 9. If you're left without, let's go back even. It's for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you're left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you're illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seems best to them, but he disciplines us for our good that we may share in his holiness. God works through all this to remind us that this life is temporary, but God is forever. I heard someone talk about watching sheep that were dipped in an antiseptic liquid so that they wouldn't get diseases. And he said, as they put them in there, those sheep squirm. They think they're being killed. They're dipping them under that, but it's for their own good. And when I encounter suffering and difficult things in my life, I just know that God's using it to kind of get rid of some extra sin in my life. And it may be the sin of comfort or the sin of dependence on this world or the sin of pride or arrogance, because God knows what's best and I don't. And I quickly become arrogant or quickly become proud or quickly forget the lessons he's taught me as soon as the pain goes away. And I go back to drinking my coffee when I know it's not good for me. But God disciplines us because he wants us to grow. And in the story of Joseph, by the way, part of the reason he spent 13 years as a slave in prison is God was molding him. If you look at Genesis 37 and you know this story, well, it says that Joseph was Jacob's favorite. And he made him this coat of multicolors. And not only was he his favorite, but his older brothers resented him. And so he had two dreams. And one of the dreams, you can read about it in verses 3 through 5 and in verse 9. One of the dreams was they were all gathering sheaves, and all of Joseph's sheaves stood up, and all of the sheaves of his brothers bowed down to him. Bowed down to Joseph. So Joseph, he's really smart, right? So he goes and tells his brothers, guess what? I had this dream and y'all all bowed down to me. And they already can't stand him. Then he has another dream, and it's the sun and moon and 11 stars, because he had 11 brothers, and they all bowed down to him. And they thought, this kid is arrogant. And I'll tell you, he was arrogant, but he was also stupid. If you have a dream like that, can you imagine? Well, I will say it. Why not? Can you imagine I have a dream the elders bowed down to me and I told them? I'd be preaching somewhere else next week, I think. You know, I'd for sure get a talking to. I haven't had a dream like that, but if I have one, I'm not going to tell them. You know, so what is he thinking? And what happens is Joseph was proud. Joseph probably was talented. Joseph was probably very gifted, and Joseph knew he had a future that was going to involve leadership, but Joseph needed to be humbled first. And God used all this to mold him to the point that when he comes to Pharaoh later, and interprets his dream. If you read about it in chapter 41, 33 through 40, after interpreting the dream to Pharaoh that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, you know what he tells him? He says, now Pharaoh, you need to find somebody in Egypt that's a wise person to put in charge of all this. You know what he doesn't say? He says, Pharaoh, I'm your guy. No, because now he's learned the lesson of humility. And he says, Pharaoh, you need to look out in the land and find somebody that's wise and put him in charge so that they can save all the food up, a fifth of it during the time of plenty, so we'll have something to feed everybody during the time of famine. And then you get to the end of that passage, and you know what Pharaoh says? Well, Pharaoh says, well, who else is there that has the Spirit of God more than this man, Joseph? So now Joseph isn't trying to elevate himself anymore. God's elevating him. Because God is preparing us and molding us sometimes in ways we don't understand. And it's not just for this world that he's molding us, but let us never forget that in the long run, he's molding us and preparing us for the next life. Do you not think that some of the lessons you learn here carry over? Do you not think some of the ways you learn to depend on God carries over? Do you not think you have gifts that God will use in heaven someday? I hope so, because the only person I know who's going to be excited singing all day, like 24 hours a day for a millennium, is Mike. I'll get bored. Mike will probably be there for several thousand years. I'm going to want to find something to do. God's preparing you for the life that comes. We just have to keep trusting and hoping. And in Hebrews chapter 11, he says this. He talks about all these people of faith, and Moses and Joseph, and he talks about Abraham, and he goes through all these. And then he says this, starting in verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, and were made strong out of weakness, and became mighty in war, and put foreign armies to flight. And women who received back their dead by resurrection. And that's where I'd like to stop right there, because you know what? That's what I'm signing up for. I'm signing up for the killing the lion and being the conqueror. But it doesn't end there. Not everybody gets called to that. He goes on to say, and some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. And they were stoned and they were sawn in two and they were killed with the sword. And they went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, that they should not be made perfect. All of them did not receive yet what God promised. And he's going to tell us in verse 13 and following, listen to this. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they're seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. I don't know about you, but my greatest hope is heaven. I'm trusting him, even if I do get cancer, even if I die, or even if my best friend died of cancer, and my other best friend died of cancer, or my dad got Alzheimer's 20 years too early. I'm trusting that God is still in control. And I read this a couple weeks ago, but it's worth rereading. And this is by Nancy Alcorn, Randy Alcorn's wife. And she was diagnosed with an incurable disease and has since died. But here's what she wrote while she was suffering. The cancer battle has been tough. However, my time with the Ancient of Days, one of my favorite names for God, has been epic. He has met me in ways that I never knew were possible. I've experienced his sovereignty, mercy, and steadfast love in tangible ways, and now I trust him in a level I never knew I could. And she says this about her cancer. My cancer is God's servant in my life. He's using it in ways he has revealed to me, and in many more I have yet to understand. I can rest knowing my cancer is under the control of a sovereign God who is good and does good. You can only believe this, people, if you believe in heaven. If you don't believe in heaven, everything I just said is hogwash. If you don't believe that God has a plan for you for eternity, then the only plan you can hope for is the plan you have right now. But God's bigger than right now. The God that created this earth will someday bring it to an end. And the God that has sent his son Jesus to suffer alongside with us has promised us something much better. And so we'll finish with these words out of Romans chapter 8. And these are the promise that we have from God. Beginning in verse 31. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. How will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Who shall bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is it who condemns? Christ Jesus is the one who died. More than that, who was raised, who's at the right hand of God, and who indeed is interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or danger, or sword? No. In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I'm sure that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. But you have to have your faith in Jesus. And that's our invitation to you today and every day, to put your faith in the one who came and suffered and died and was raised to give us this hope. Let's stand and sing.